We hear about it all the time, right? Split-second decisions that lead to huge consequences.
Yeah, those moments that change everything.
And today we're diving into a story where that's exactly what happened. We're going to be looking at the case of Timothy Batts and his 11-year-old daughter, Tamama.
It's a really tragic case.
It is, and it raises so many questions about gun ownership, being a parent, even the justice system in general.
Absolutely. A
Uh,
lot of layers to unpack there.
Absolutely. So to get the full picture, we've got court transcripts, we've got analyses of the surveillance footage,
We even have some first-hand accounts.
really trying to get a complete understanding of what happened.
Yeah, a real deep dive.
Exactly. So it all starts on what should have been a totally normal day. Tamama's first day of middle school. Knoxdoss Middle School, just outside of Nashville.
Oh, I can picture her, new outfit, that brand new backpack.
The first day of school energy.
Yeah,
Right?
totally.
But while she's off at school, hitting this big milestone, back at home, things are going very differently for her dad, Timothy.
And that's where this story takes a really difficult turn. We know from security footage that Timothy was at home, pacing around with a loaded gun.
Well, he was on the phone, right?
Yeah, like he wasn't even really paying attention to what he was doing.
So Tima gets home from school later that afternoon, excited to tell her dad all about her day, and, well, that's when everything goes wrong.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that, at first, Timothy told the police that Tema came home already hurt.
He said she'd been shot by someone outside.
Right, but the investigators, they started noticing things that didn't add up.
The surveillance footage from inside the house told a very different story. It showed him with the gun and then the shot.
It's chilling, isn't it? Just seeing how quickly a situation can turn deadly.
And what makes it even more tragic is that Tamama, after she was shot, she asked her father, "Did I shoot you?"
It's just heartbreaking. Her first thought was about her dad.
Shows you just how confused and scared she must have been.
Absolutely devastating. And it doesn't stop there, right? Later, during the trials, Timothy breaks down on the stand, recounting Tamama's last words.
It's hard to even imagine.
He told the court, she said, "Daddy, just tell me this is a dream, and Daddy, I know it was an accident. I'm not mad at you."
Those words are just gut-wrenching. Really makes you think about the emotional weight of this whole situation.
It does, and legally speaking, there were some serious questions to answer, right? Timothy was charged with reckless homicide and also gun possession because he'd been convicted of a felony in the past.
Right, so let's break that down a little. Reckless homicide, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, legally speaking.
So basically it means that someone caused a death by being so reckless, so careless, that it goes way beyond what a normal person would do. Like, they just totally disregarded the risks. It's more serious than an accident, but it's not intentional.
And then, because Timothy had those previous convictions for drugs, he wasn't supposed to have a gun at all.
Exactly. It complicated the whole thing.
But, this case goes beyond just the legal stuff.
Oh, absolutely. It brought up some really tough moral and ethical questions, too.
During the trial, there were two very different sides to the story. Timothy's supporters, they saw this shooting as a horrible accident, like a father just trying to protect his family.
And they pointed to how much he regretted it and how he rushed her to the hospital himself.
But on the other hand, you had the prosecutors who said, look, he wasn't supposed to have a gun, especially with a criminal record.
Right.
They said that's just asking for trouble, and it led directly to Tama's death.
They were making the argument that this wasn't just bad luck, it was a result of him breaking the law and being reckless.
So not just a wrong place, wrong time situation, but a direct consequence of his own choices.
Exactly, and that's what the jury had to wrestle with. How do you balance this horrible tragedy with the law and deciding if his actions were actually criminal?
Yeah, sounds like they were facing a real dilemma. But, this whole thing goes even deeper, right? It wasn't just about Timothy and Tamama. It really sparked a huge conversation about guns, especially when there are kids in the house.
Definitely. Made people really think about how to keep those environments safe.
Like, what does it really mean to be a responsible gun owner?
Huge questions. And tragically, this case brought them to the forefront.
So that's really where our deep dive begins, right? Looking beyond just this one case and seeing the bigger issues it brings up.
Absolutely. There's a lot more to uncover here.
We'll be doing that as we go further into this episode. There's so much more to discuss.
It's hard to imagine being on a jury, right? Especially a case like this.
Oh, absolutely. Talk about pressure.
Yeah, and it's not about deciding if Timothy's a good guy or a bad guy.
Right. It's not a popularity contest.
It's about looking at the law. Did the state actually prove he did what they're saying he did?
And in this case, that means really looking at the evidence for reckless homicide and, of course, the gun possession charge.
Two very different things, legally speaking. It's almost like putting a puzzle together, you know?
Yeah, seeing how each piece fits.
And sometimes the pieces don't fit perfectly. The jury has to make the best judgment they can with what they have.
Okay, so let's break it down. Starting with reckless homicide, what were the main arguments from both sides?
Well, for the prosecution, they had to show that what Timothy did was way beyond what a normal person would do. Like, a reasonable person, even if they were startled, wouldn't just shoot without knowing who they're shooting at.
Especially in their own house.
Right. You'd think you'd be extra careful at home.
Especially with a loaded gun.
Exactly. And remember, he shouldn't have even had a gun because of his record. So the prosecution used that to say, look, he was already breaking the law, taking a huge risk, and it led to this horrible outcome.
So they were painting a picture of Timothy as someone who just doesn't care about the rules.
Yeah, like it wasn't just a mistake, it was part of a bigger pattern.
Okay, but what about the defense? What was their side of the story?
Their focus was all about Timothy's mindset during the shooting. They said he was truly scared, thought someone was breaking in.
He had been napping, right?
Yeah, so maybe he was groggy, disoriented, not thinking straight when he heard something and reacted.
So they were trying to make him seem more human. Like anyone could have made that mistake in that situation.
Exactly. And they pointed to how much he regretted it. Rushing Tama to the hospital himself, trying to show that he loved his daughter and messed up, but he wasn't some heartless criminal.
It's amazing how both sides used the same evidence but saw completely differently.
It happens all the time. The prosecution's focused on the facts, the law. The defense is trying to get the jury to connect with Timothy emotionally.
Putting them in his shoes.
Exactly. And for the jury, it must have been so hard to separate all of that.
Yeah, weighing the legal stuff, recklessness, negligence, and then the emotional impact, a young girl's death, a father dealing with what he did.
It's a heavy burden for sure.
So it makes you wonder, if you were on that jury, what would you have done? What evidence would have stuck out to you?
It's a tough question. You got to look at the law, but you can't ignore the human side of it either. These split-second decisions, especially when guns are involved, they can have such huge consequences.
That's what makes this case so powerful. It's not just a legal puzzle. It's a story about fear, loss. It makes us think about how easy it is for things to go terribly wrong.
And it forces us to confront these big questions about guns, responsibility, mental health, things we need to talk about as a society.
So we've looked at the charges, the arguments, the evidence. Now let's see what happened when the jury made their decision. What was the verdict? So the jury had a lot to consider. What did they decide?
They found Timothy guilty.
On both counts?
Both. Reckless homicide and gun possession as a felon. They agreed with the prosecution. His actions were criminal.
Wow, so even with all the emotion, the defense's arguments, the jury didn't see it as just a tragic accident.
Right, they had to look at each charge separately. And those prior felonies, owning a gun illegally, that played a big part.
It definitely makes the whole thing more serious. So what happened? What was the sentence?
11 years?
11 years, yeah.
1 year for every year of Tama's life.
That's heavy. The judge really wanted to send a message.
Absolutely. About responsible gun ownership, the consequences of reckless decisions.
Even though he didn't mean to kill his daughter, the judge felt like there had to be accountability.
It shows how complicated these cases are. The law has to balance punishment, protecting the public, giving people a chance to change. It's not always simple.
It reminds us that our choices, especially with guns, they can have impacts we don't even realize.
And in this case, a young girl lost her life because of it. It could have been prevented.
And, even with the trial, the sentence, it feels like there's no real justice. You can't bring Tama back.
Right. And that's something Timothy will have to live with, the guilt, the grief. That's a burden he'll carry forever.
It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the legal system isn't enough. It can't erase the pain.
Exactly. And that's why we do this, right? These deep dives. We look at the specifics of a case, but we also use it to talk about the bigger issues.
Yeah, gun safety, responsible ownership. How do we prevent these tragedies from happening again?
We have to have these tough conversations as individuals, as communities.
This case, it's been hard to talk about all those difficult details.
But if it makes even one person think differently about guns, about safety, if it starts a conversation, then maybe something good can come out of it.
So as we finish up this deep dive, I think that's the question we all need to ask ourselves. What can we do to make a difference? How can we make the world safer? The answers might not be easy, but we got to start somewhere.